In Chapter 18, we'll see the second of the cardiovascular chapters that deals with blood vessels. And so on the first slide, we'll see some of the major functions for blood vessels, including number one, carrying or transporting the blood, and anything in the blood is being transported. Then number two is exchanging different things, exchanging nutrients or waste products or gases, and this is accomplished by a particular type, a specific type of blood vessel known as a capillary, and we'll talk about those a little later on. Number three is transporting different items or substances throughout the body through the blood, including hormones, just like we talked about in Chapter 16, various enzymes and nutrients. Nutrients could be glucose or amino acids or lipids, anything the body needs as far as a building block for the body as a nutrient. Gases are transported by the blood, and that would be carbon dioxide and oxygen. And then any waste products that are generated by the cells or cell metabolism have to be transported in the blood as well. Number four is that blood vessels help to regulate blood pressure, and they can do this through being able to constrict and relax, and that actually changes blood pressure in various areas throughout the body. And number five, they can actually help in directing blood flow, because some vessels, as we'll see a little later on, such as veins, actually have valves, and those valves allow for one-directional blood flow. Now, to begin with, there's three main types of vessels we'll be talking about: arteries, veins, and capillaries, and we'll see other breakdowns of these and examples of these in the lab portion. But here we see some characteristics about each one of the main categories. Arteries always carry blood away from the heart. Usually that means that they're going to be oxygen rich. But if you remember, there is an exception to that rule, is that the pulmonary arteries are carrying blood away from the heart, but they're actually oxygen poor, and that's because they're sending blood from the heart over to the lungs. They're usually relatively thick, and they usually have a lot of elastic type tissue in the walls of the arteries. Veins always carry blood toward the heart, and so that's blood returning back to the heart will be carried in veins. And the only exception to that rule, of course, would be pulmonary veins, and that's because pulmonary veins are coming directly from the lungs, and they're carrying oxygen-rich blood from the lungs back to the heart, but they're still going toward the heart. Veins are relatively thick as well. They just don't have as much elastic as arteries. And then capillaries, we've already talked about. These are the smallest of the vessels, and their main function is exchange. In the diagram here, you see a kind of a standard diagram for a vessel. We'll talk about three main layers to blood vessels. These layers or walls are called tunics or layers. Tunica intima, this is the innermost layer. Tunica media is the middle layer. And the tunica externa is the outer layer. And you can kind of see in the diagram some of the main parts of this. And this is something else we'll kind of go through in lab as well. Tunica intima is the innermost layer, which is basically endothelial cells. It's epithelial tissue on the inside of something called endothelial cells. It does have a basal lamina, a little bit of connective tissue kind of wrapped around that. Then you have the tunica media layer. The main part of this is the muscle layer. So that's where you find the smooth muscle part of a blood vessel in the tunica media layer. And then covering that, you have the tunica externa, or the external layer, and you have connective tissue there on the outside of a blood vessel. In this picture, you see a slide image, a micrograph image of an artery and vein that kind of depicts those three layers. So both arteries and veins have all three of these layers, tunica intima, media, and the externa. Sometimes you see that external layer called the adventitia layer, but it's still the outer layer. The difference is you see a difference in sizes. So the intima layer is pretty much a single layer thick on both the artery and the vein. But the media layer is different. It's more muscular for the artery and less muscular for the vein. Now, there are a couple of examples of arteries. We'll talk about really three examples of arteries. The first example is what's called the elastic or conducting artery. This is the largest of the arteries that you have, and that includes the aorta and some of the major branches of the aorta. This is the largest artery, and so you have more blood flow here, and so you have higher blood pressure here as well. The second group of arteries are called muscular arteries. This is what most people think of when you think of maybe the arteries in your body, such as the brachial artery or the radial artery or the femoral artery. These are most of your general type arteries that you find, the most common type of artery that you find in the body. And they're also referred to as distributing arteries because that's their main job, is to distribute blood flow out to the tissues. And so these do allow for some regulation of blood supply and blood pressure because they do have that smooth muscle that can either constrict or dilate, and that allows some regulation of blood flow. And you see here that the muscular arteries have relatively thick walls that have that tunica media layer has about 25 to 40 layers of smooth muscle that make up that middle layer. Arterioles, this is the smallest of the arteries that we have, and this still has all three layers. So the smallest artery where all three layers, all three tunics can be identified, and so their main job is to connect arteries with the capillaries. And so they still can go through vasoconstriction and vasodilation because they still have that smooth muscle layer. Now let's look at some veins. There are different size veins as well, and so the smallest of the veins would be the venules, and they're just smaller veins, and their job is to connect with the capillaries and drain blood from the capillaries and eventually connect to larger and larger veins. So you have like a medium vein and a larger vein. Veins in generally have thinner walls and a little bit less elastic than the arteries are, and a little bit less smooth muscle. And many veins actually have valves, just like in the picture here, you see a valve here, and that allows for blood flow in a single direction. It also helps blood not to pool or collect in your extremities, in your lower extremities. Now capillaries, these are the smallest of the vessels that you have, and again we mentioned that these capillaries are for exchange of some type of substance, whether it's gas exchange or nutrient exchange or waste product moving in and out of the or moving into the bloodstream. And so here you have kind of what capillaries are made out of. They're basically simple squamous epithelial cells, and so they're referred to as endothelial cells because they are lining the inside of something, in this case the capillary here. And they do have a basal layer around it, or a basement membrane around it, and a little bit of connective tissue wrapped around that capillary. Sometimes you see other cells associated with capillaries, such as a pericyte. That's what this cell means. Peri comes from the word meaning perimeter or around, and so this cell is kind of located around a capillary. It actually has the ability to contract or to squeeze, and this allows a little bit of blood flow regulation. See, the capillaries don't have the tunica media layer like the other vessels do, and so so it relies on these pericytes to help these very small blood vessels contract a little bit. These are very small, and so like in the micrograph here, you see an example of a capillary where blood cells, red blood cells, are basically traveling through here kind of single file because it's such a small vessel. Then a couple of words, vocabulary words associated with vessels and associated with aging of the vessels. As vessels get older or the arteries get older, they may experience these two phenomena here. Arteriosclerosis is a term meaning that the arteries lose some of their elastic ability. It can be caused by different things, different factors, but they can lose some of their elasticity. That's called arteriosclerosis. Atherosclerosis can lead to arteriosclerosis, but atherosclerosis is where plaque formation forms on the walls of the arteries, and many times they believe this is due to lipids or cholesterol that settle out in the vessels, but that many times can lead to loss of elasticity. All right, in section 2, we'll look a little bit about some of the physiology of the blood flow, which is really called hemodynamics. We'll look at blood flow dynamics, the movement of blood flow throughout through the vessels and really look at the relationship between three main factors: pressure or blood pressure, the movement of blood or flow, and then resistance to flow. So to do that, we need to understand a little bit about blood pressure. First of all, the definition is listed there for you. It is the force of the blood that's pushing against the wall of the vessel. And so, of course, that force, that blood pressure, is generated by the heart. It's creating that pressure, and then it's measured through the different vessels. And movement is caused by moving blood from a high pressure area to a low pressure area. And so that's called a pressure gradient. And there's really two different types of flow that you'll see. One is called laminar flow, or a streamline type flow. Sometimes this is called uninterrupted flow. And so this is where blood is flowing very smoothly along the length of a vessel. There's nothing there to obstruct it. There's nothing there to slow it down. It's moving without any type of obstruction, and it's very streamlined. And so in the diagram, you kind of see a scenario where you have a blood vessel and blood is flowing through unrestricted. And usually in the middle, this is where you have the fastest moving blood flow in the middle. And along the edges, along the perimeter, you have a little bit of slowdown there. That's just because a little bit of drag or a little resistance caused by the vessel wall. Turbulent blood flow is shown in this picture. This is where a laminar flow gets interrupted by something. Maybe there's a constriction in the vessel, or a turn in the vessel, or just some other cause of where blood flow slows down that interrupts the laminar flow. That's called turbulent blood flow. Now, this is what creates the sounds whenever you are taking somebody's blood pressure. And those are called Korotkoff sounds. When you take a blood pressure, you're actually listening for turbulent flow. It could indicate some type of abnormality. Maybe there's some kind of constriction that's not supposed to be there. Maybe there's a blood clot or a thrombosis that's located there, and that's causing some kind of turbulent flow. Now, to understand hemodynamics, we also need to understand a couple of the equations. We've already seen the MAP equation, and that was covered back in the previous chapter. In the heart, MAP, or the blood pressure, the mean arterial pressure, is a factor of cardiac output and resistance. And so that for blood flow, really, this second bullet point is the definition of flow. Volume, in this case, the volume of blood that passes a point per unit of time. And so for our example, when we looked at the MAP equation, we were saying that cardiac output was basically a flow. Cardiac output is how much blood comes out of the heart per minute. And so here we see that definition of flow applies to cardiac output. Well, in the equation here, flow is equal to pressure divided by resistance. This is really the MAP equation that has been solved for flow. So in other words, if you take cardiac output up here and you put it on the other side of the equation, you reverse these, then you get cardiac output is equal to pressure over resistance. And so that's what we have here at flow. So it's basically the same equation, it's just written in terms of flow. So blood flow through a vessel is a function of pressure over resistance. Now, to understand resistance, we need to understand another term called viscosity. Viscosity, by definition, is the measure of the resistance to flow of a liquid. So if you think about different liquids, like oil or syrup would be more viscous than water is because it has more resistance to flow. And so the idea is that as viscosity increases, as a fluid gets thicker, then it slows down. And so the flow decreases, but the pressure required to push that fluid through the vessel is going to increase. And so once we kind of understand some of these factors, we can build on that. And so in this slide, I have the original flow equation that we started with. Flow is a factor of pressure over resistance. The other thing about this equation you can see is if something is in the numerator here, then it's going to be directly proportional to flow. So for example, if pressure goes up, that means flow is going to go up. Think about a water hose at your house. if the pressure of the water goes up, then the amount of water coming out is going to also go up. Well, that's the same as your blood vessels. As the pressure of as your blood pressure goes up, the amount of flow going through that vessel goes up. If it's on the denominator, the bottom portion of the equation, then it's going to be inversely related to flow. So resistance. If resistance increases, then that means the flow is going to decrease. So if there's a constriction in a vessel and that causes resistance, in this case, resistance to increase, that causes a constriction causes resistance to increase, that means flow through that area, through that vessel, will decrease. So flow and resistance will be opposite. Well, if you think about resistance, there's really a couple of things to consider when looking at resistance. First of all, you have viscosity, just like we mentioned. Viscosity and resistance are directly proportional. They're on the same side of the, they're both in the numerator here. So viscosity, if the thickness of the blood increases, resistance is going to increase. Length of the vessel, that's really a constant, but if you think about it, the length of the vessel, if a vessel is longer, that causes the resistance to increase because there's more friction traveling as the blood is traveling through the bloodstream. Then on the denominator, in the denominator here we have diameter, or you could have radius here, but how big is the vessel? The vessel diameter. If the diameter increases, that means resistance is going to decrease. So you have a larger vessel, that means there's less resistance. The number 128, that is a constant, and so that is just included in the equation to try to balance out the equation here. And so for our purposes, the three main factors here that influence resistance would be viscosity, length of the vessel, and then the diameter. Now, there's something called Pizzelles Law that we'll look at, which basically combines both of these equations, the flow equation and the resistance equation, and they take resistance equation and combine it with the flow equation by substituting all of this for resistance where the R is. So we take all of this equation here, substitute it where the R is, and we come up with this equation. This is known as Pizzelles Law, which combines both the flow and resistance, and it helps us to look at everything in one equation. And so here you see that blood flow through a vessel is directly proportional to everything on the top of the equation, pressure and diameter. So what that means is if pressure increases, flow is going to increase. If pressure decreases, flow decreases. Diameter, if the vessel expands or dilates or gets bigger, then the flow increases. If the diameter gets smaller, maybe there's a constriction in the vessel, then the flow decreases. And on the bottom of the equation, the denominator is going to be inversely related. So viscosity is opposite of flow. So if viscosity increases, if it gets thicker, the blood gets thicker, then flow is going to decrease. And then length pretty much stays the same.